In June of 2019, I took a trip to Grafton, West Virginia, and made a video about the legendary Grafton monster supposedly witnessed by newspaper reporter Robert Cockrell in 1964. The town's search for the monster was printed in two short and dismissive articles in Cockrell's own paper, the Grafton Sentinel. Further details of his monster sighting were hidden away for decades in a letter to UFO researcher and prankster Gray Barker, cataloged within the Clarksburg Library's Barker Archive. Once rediscovered, it was further popularized, featured in media, and adopted into West Virginia's pantheon of mythology. Since the making of my video on the subject, there have been some updates in the case. Consider this video a follow-up or companion piece of sorts. As mentioned previously, Robert Cockrell repeatedly declined any attempt to interview him or ask him questions about the case, despite several folklore researchers trying. Even the respectful West Virginia author George Dunning, who wrote a short book on the Grafton Monster in 2019, asked to speak with him on the topic but was declined. If even a nice older fella like George Dunning couldn't get through to him with an open invitation to speak whatever truth he had, then a long-haired weirdo like myself certainly wasn't going to do the trick either. Some supposed witnesses are just no longer interested in the story. On December 9th, 2022, Robert Cockrell passed away. Another update that might shed a bit of light into why Robert Cockrell was so hesitant to talk about the monster was found on the Grafton Monster Facebook page, a post telling about an article Robert Cockrell penned in 2014. You see, after the monster was reportedly rediscovered by researcher Mark Hall in 1995, and printed in Chapter 1 of Rosemary Ellen Golly's 2012 Monsters of West Virginia book, it was then featured in an April 14, 2014 episode of the sensationalistic TV show Mountain Monsters. The episode, as usual, featured the cast running around the dark via night vision and looking for a legendary monster of Appalachian lore. According to the Facebook post, the episode crew never even came to Grafton, and the so-called resident that appeared on the episode was reportedly someone that no one in Grafton had ever met. This reportedly caused Robert Cockrell to write an article for the Mountain Statesman newspaper, formerly the Grafton Sentinel, supposedly recanting the entire Grafton monster story. The Facebook post states, quote, "This is rather shocking when you read his letter to Gray, in which he is 100% convinced of what he saw, and remembered it in quite some detail. Many think he was embarrassed by the betrayal of Grafton in the show, and wanted to distance the town from that mess. What he didn't account for was Bethesda, one of the largest gaming manufacturers, to make the Headless Terror one of the centerpieces of their new game Fallout 76, set in West Virginia. So the legend persists and will continue on for ages, and has now gone worldwide." End quote. This certainly is an important epilogue to the Grafton Monster story that requires some attention, and so it will be included in this video. When I first saw it, I had to wonder, in what way had he supposedly retracted the story? Did he say it was a hoax on either his part or on that of Gray Barker? Did he say it was some kind of misidentification, or that he had a better explanation for it? Or did he simply shrug his shoulders and tell everyone not to worry about it because it probably wasn't a big deal anyway? What kind of recantment was it? At the time I didn't yet know. The post didn't contain a link or photo of the reported Mountain Statesman article. I have since confirmed the article's existence, and his reported motivation, though I'll speak on that later in the video. In June of 2019, before the pandemic confounded my traveling, I visited the Taylor County Public Library, which has the microfiche archives of the Grafton Sentinel / Mountain Statesman. With my limited time there traveling around the town and archives for the video, I was able to look at the original 1964 articles and get copies of them. I asked the librarian if any other articles on the monster were printed in the years following, including more recently. She said that was it, and that most people had forgotten all about the monster until Fallout 76 came out. She also mentioned that the town put up a sign along the river where the monster was supposedly sighted. I've mentioned in videos previously how the sign was then stolen, returned, and then put atop a coffee shop called Espresso Yourself, which sold Grafton Monster t-shirts. Oh, another thing I was going to mention about the Grafton Monster, the sign that's on top of the coffee shop now, it used to be actually on plywood where the monster was supposedly seen, but apparently it was stolen, but they managed to get it back, and I guess they decided to put it up so people couldn't get it again. So I think that's a bizarre thing that happened there. It was a news story. The Grafton Sentinel, which became the Mountain Statesman, was actually the newspaper that first printed the Grafton Monster story, and it's also the newspaper in which the witness worked for, Robert Cockrell, and that newspaper put out a picture of these policemen holding up the sign when they got it back, and so it's just kind of funny that the monster, all these years later, gets put in the same paper again. After seeing the Facebook post in early 2020, I thought perhaps the guy that ran the coffee place also ran the Facebook page, but I didn't know and wasn't able to visit it while there. Then the pandemic happened, and I wasn't able to return for further research. I've since learned that the coffee shop packed up and moved along, with its owner reportedly taking the Grafton Monster sign along with him. The Taylor County librarian didn't know about the recampment article, of course, and I didn't know about the Mountain Monsters Day at the time, or else I would have tried to scan through all the 2014 film to prove or disprove it. I did think about going inside the Mountain Statesman office while there in 2019, and asking if they knew about other monster articles, like if it had been mentioned for anniversaries of the sighting or things like that. But my sister advised me not to, and time limitations got the better of me. Even if I had done so, they probably wouldn't have known about the article. Of course, in 2022, I heard of Robert Cockrell's passing. Fast forward to 2024. On June 15th and 16th, a 2-day festival was set to be held in downtown Grafton, West Virginia. It was to be the first ever Grafton Monster Festival. It was also supposed to be the opening day of a Grafton Monster Museum. They clearly had taken their cues from Point Pleasant, West Virginia and the Mothman. Even the Flatwoods Monster and West Virginia Bigfoot had a festival museum, so why not the Grafton Monster? Everyone needs a reason to celebrate strangeness. I was only able to go the first day, and unfortunately had to arrive late. I filmed around at all the West Virginia folklore-themed items. There were some woodworkings, some artist drawing and folk art, and of course, I just missed the psychic. That's actually a running joke the universe has been playing on me, missing the psychic. Back in 2018, when doing a guest talk about Mothman at a Haunted Relic Expo in Moundsville, West Virginia, long story, there was a psychic table among the vendors. Of course, the moment that I stepped off stage, they were gone, and I couldn't get a reading. Another time, after driving past an old-looking psychic shop named Psychic Eye several times in South Charleston, I was finally able to stop. The door was closed. I knocked on it several times. Nothing. I peered in through the window. The place had been closed down for years. There's gotta be a metaphor in there somewhere. I've yet to be able to satisfy my curiosity for psychic phenomena or ESP. It's a running gag. It's pretty funny. I miss the psychic. To some people, I guess, the future is closed off. I'm certainly not a believer after all. I'm much too skeptical for that. So I guess it makes sense. The town's shops had drawings from local elementary school students, answering, "What do you think the Grafton Monster looked like?" It's an interesting look into the zeitgeist. You can see that many of the children already know what the monster is supposed to look like, through folklore or media. But other children have clearly never heard of this specific monster, and therefore give their own original take. No wrong answers. The Grafton Monster's design is unique in its lack of detail. It's essentially a bulky, amorphous form, described somewhere between a white obstruction and a headless creature. To folklore fans, in the lineup of West Virginia monsters, it's recognizable, but at the first quick glance, when printed on a t-shirt or object, it's harder to pick out than the Flatwoods Monster or the Mothman, for instance. The 3D printed figures are therefore mostly little hunks of plastic, and seeing the monster in a necklace looks like someone wearing a strange blob that could be almost anything. Here's a good question from my other video on the Grafton Monster that I should include here for the sake of completeness. The user ShadowTech asks, "What Michigan monster was the newspaper referring to?" I replied, "It's referring to a Sasquatch sighting in Sister Lakes, Michigan from that same month of June 1964. The news editor is trying to say that the publicity of that sighting inspired the monster, but the Grafton Monster isn't a Sasquatch and really has no similarity in appearance. Here's a wiki article on that story if you're interested. Wikipedia.org/wiki/Dewey Lake Monster." Another comment to share. The user UFO Scriptorum added, "The young witnesses of that time could still be alive." I replied, "Yes. Robert Cockrell declines to be interviewed, but the monster hunters of the time may still be out there. None of them were named, and none of them to my knowledge have come forward to share their experiences in the decades since. Maybe now they will. I'll add now that I think that is pretty unlikely." The new Grafton Monster Museum was supposed to have its debut opening during the festival in June of 2024. Though due to construction delays and unforeseen issues, it wasn't ready. The opening was postponed and didn't happen during the festival. Instead, some of the museum's information standees were propped up near the window for festival goers to get a sneak peek of what the museum could contain when opened. Looking through the window, I could see the newspaper articles on display. The festival organizer and museum owner, Alyssa Lyons, was seated at a table in front of the museum. I was able to talk with her briefly, and during the discussion I asked about the 2014 article in which Robert Cockrell reportedly retracted his sighting. She said she had heard of it, but didn't have it displayed. She grabbed a notepad and wrote it down to not forget, saying that she definitely wanted to include that, because she was interested in telling the full story with all sides. As she wrote it down, I couldn't help but think, as I often do with my folklore studies, what butterfly effect my mentioning that might have had. Sometimes I think of my sharing information on folklore mythology as like a bee pollinating flowers. One interesting thing is that back in 2020, after I posted photos of the newspaper scans and transcribed them online, the Grafton Monster Facebook page I mentioned posted those photos along with the transcription on their page. You can see that they're the photos I took because I had them in shiny plastic sleeves. Others have since shared and used those photos, and can be easily spotted by the inadvertently shiny plastic. It's always interesting to see my fingerprints on the subjects I research, and to see my posts fill up result pages that were nearly empty before. Of course, I consider everything I do to be public domain, and folklore builds through mockingbirds, repetition, and iteration. It's a collective thing. I understand and embrace that. Take a look at some of the interesting sights around the Grafton Monster Festival.
You're welcome to it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go for it.
The jackalope are cool.
Thank you.
If I had the money, I would get one.
I feel that.
Well, if you're close to that, we can work on a price if you really want one.
Yeah,
150. Nah, I'm not close.
I get it.
I understand. Just want to let people know that we can barter, or not. Well,
Not
I guess we
barter
can
as
barter,
much, but
haggle.
haggle's more like, yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess for the right stuff, I'll barter.
Yeah, you bartered for Warhammer
I have
before.
bartered all my life.
The festival had an open corkboard with notes and pins to add your own theory about what the Grafton Monster could be. Many festival goers had already added their colorful and lively theories on the matter. I added my own wild and hypothetical theory to the mix for fun. There were multiple different interesting guests in attendance at the Grafton Monster Festival. My friend and fellow researcher Jimmy of Spooky Appalachia went to the festival, but I missed him and he was gone by the time I arrived. I looked around all over, but found only a magnet as evidence he was there. Another person I looked for but was unable to locate was folklore author Kurt McCoy. He wrote a book called White Things, which covered the strange trend of various West Virginia monster reports which are white in coloration. This includes a chapter on the Grafton Monster. The only time I'd seen a physical copy of this book available was at the Taylor Public Library, though there are of course ebooks. I was able to meet Sasquatch researcher Les Odell and get a photo with him. I've greatly enjoyed some of the videos on his channel West Virginia Case. He's able to drive around to supposed sighting locations, and interview reported witnesses both in person and via voice call. He was also featured in Small Town Monsters' 2020 documentary, The Mothman Legacy. He seems like a very salt-of-the-earth guy, and has made some great folkloric and paranormal content. He's also a very outdoorsy person, and looks much more like a Sasquatch researcher than I do. Though funnily enough, he's reportedly from very northern West Virginia, meaning technically I'm more southern than he is. You'd never guess. Another person in attendance who I was on the lookout for was Tony Breeden, the author of several books on the subject of flying saucer researcher and prankster Gray Barker. His book series, entitled Gray Barker's Book of Monsters, has released several volumes. He actually left a comment on my previous Grafton Monster video, which reads as follows. I've researched Gray Barker for the past decade. In researching his life and stories, I've been able to determine that about 85% of his accounts are direct reports of newspaper or UFO magazine articles. Another 10% contain errors or deviations, like a storyteller misremembering the city or the date. These minor errors generally occur in accounts where Barker is giving the tale a storyteller's flourish, making it more interesting than a dry journalistic retelling, but not changing any essential details. Only about 5% or less of Barker's material was created out of whole cloth. Barker was only just returning to UFO research after a hiatus. This might have been the story that drew him back in. Cockrell came to Barker after being discredited by his own newspaper. This doesn't sound like yellow journalism, especially since from his newspaper's POV, the story was over. One last note, Barker's The Grafton Monster story wasn't intended for a magazine. That is, what we have in the archive bears the earmarks of a radio script. He was unable to get the story on Long John Nebel's show. I was unable to determine which New York radio program he recorded the story for. I looked for Tony Breeden at the festival, but only a month later was able to talk to him at the Veggie Man Day event in Fairmont, West Virginia. I'll fast forward in time a bit to cover that here. In our discussion, we talked about the Grafton Monster Festival, and he mentioned that he was able to attend Robert Cockrell's daughter's presentation there. He was able to answer my question about how it was retracted, stating that Robert Cockrell essentially claimed that it was most likely a misidentification, and that he and his daughter both seemed to ignore Cockrell's letter to Gray Barker about the monster. Tony Breeden made the point about how Cockrell sounded so serious in the Barker letter, and about how Cockrell had mentioned investigating other supposed cases in the letter. I asked Tony Breeden if he had a copy of the Retraction article, or knew where to find it, but he didn't. I told him about the 2014 date in association with the Mountain Monsters episode air, and we discussed how we could check the microfilm at the library using the date to find the Retraction article. After I left the Fairmont Vegetable Man Day event in July, I hoped that maybe Tony Breeden or some other researcher would find that article and post it online, to save me the trouble of making an extra trip down to the Taylor County Library. And before I could say supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, a fellow West Virginian by the name of Daniel A. Reed wrote an article for the Skeptical Inquirer, which included the Mountain Statesman article. The following is the article. Letter to the Editor. Dear Editor, Requiem for a Monster. The story behind the Grafton Monster. The Grafton Monster would have turned 50 in June of this year. It was a good old monster. Its description was vague enough to not be too scary, but interesting enough to chase on a warm summer's evening. It came into being on a dark night in June of 1964 as an unexplained shape by the side of the road, and was fleshed out by the rumor mill, dressed up and sent on its way with each new telling of the tale. The Grafton that gave birth to the monster was a much different place than the Grafton of today. It was a close-knit community where most people knew each other, because they all worked, lived, went to school, and played in the same town. It was a great place to grow up and a great place to live. Tell a story at Biggie's or Tasty Freeze and you would hear it back in about an hour at Malone's drugstore or the Dairy Queen, and it might even still bear some semblance to the facts contained in the first telling. The 17-year-old part-time reporter for the Grafton Sentinel told his friends what he thought he saw in the dark on Riverside Drive, and by the time he heard the story back to him by another friend, it had become a full-blown monster, and the hunt was on. In the light of the day, the monster was most likely a fixture on the Grafton roadways, and a local character by the name of Tommy Peters. He could be seen riding his bicycle all over the town, at all hours of the night and day. He always had it loaded down with his finds for the day. On the night of the monster sighting, he was pedaling down Riverside Drive in the dark and without a light, loaded down with boxes piled high on the back of his bicycle. Approaching him from behind at highway speeds, all you saw would be a large dark shape moving between the road and the river. Now for the article in the Grafton Sentinel. The young reporter told his editor what he initially thought he saw, and how that sighting had taken on a life of its own. The editor, Tom Russell, a great guy and a journalist with a lifetime of experience in newspapers and an eye for news, saw the story for what it was. Not a sensationalized story about a make-believe monster, but a real news story about what locals were doing as a result of the story of a monster making its rounds. And that was the story he had the reporter research and write, and the story he published. Several days later, a follow-up story was published pointing out the dangers of all the people coming to Riverside Drive, and the chance of getting someone hurt, along with the report that the monster was most likely just the shape of someone pushing a cart of boxes down the road at night. The monster will not die. Every so many years, someone digs the story back up, adds non-existent details, and sends it back out the door. In 2012, a paperback was published entitled Monsters of West Virginia by Rosemary Ellen Golly, published by Stackpole Books. The first chapter after the introduction is titled, You Guessed It, The Grafton Monster. The quotes attributed to the young reporter were never made. The majority of what the book said happened after the sighting is pure fiction, and the so-called follow-up investigation by the reporter never happened. But why mess up a good monster story with the facts? The TV show on the Grafton Monster is even worse, and it gives West Virginians a public relations black eye to boot. The fact is that there is no Grafton Monster, and there never was a Grafton Monster. How do I know that for a fact? Because I am that young reporter 50 years removed from the birth of the monster. Rest in peace, old monster. Robert R. Cockrell. Robert Cockrell in 2014 was clearly disenchanted and no longer believed in his own sighting. He claims that what he saw was not a hoax, but an honest misidentification that got blown out of proportion. It's perfectly fine to recant a sighting, or to lose confidence in what you saw later on with age and wisdom. Though curiously, he tries to make it seem as if he never believed in what he saw at all, when the archived letter to Gray Barker would certainly prove otherwise. Even stranger, he accuses Fortean author Rosemary Ellen Guiley of misattributing quotes, and claims her write-up was inaccurate. Reading through, you can see that the quotes Cockrell says were never made all come word for word from that 1964 letter to UFO researcher and prankster Gray Barker, which was signed Robert Cockrell and typed on a Grafton Sentinel newspaper letterhead. Rosemary sticks very closely to the archived letter as a primary source, mostly paraphrasing it when not quoting it directly. Is Robert claiming the Barker letter to be fake? He never mentions Barker once in the 2014 article, never says there to be a forged letter, and it would make no sense for Barker to fake such a letter, have such details on the Grafton story and on Cockrell, and then hide them away for decades to never use it. He gives no reason why the quotation is inaccurate, just that they were never made. I can only conclude, charitably, that perhaps Robert Cockrell didn't know where Rosemary was getting such quotes, and wasn't aware of such a letter, even when it's outright mentioned in the book. Surely a former newspaper worker would understand how serious it is to reportedly accuse someone of such misquotation. Robert also says that the events after the sighting in the book were not factual, but once again they come from his own purported words in 1964, which any Grafton Monster write-up would undoubtedly stem from as well. His motivation at the time seems to be to distance himself or downplay his involvement. I'll add that there is also an age discrepancy. He says in 2014 that he was 17 at the time of the sighting, though Gray Barker wrote in 1964 that he was reportedly a fellow in his middle 20s. While I understand his distaste for the reality TV show Mountain Monsters, of which I am also not a fan, I don't understand why he would pass the buck on to Rosemary Ellen Guiley, whose chapter on the Grafton Monster is clearly just a write-up based on his own 1964 letter. I do indeed think that the reason the Mountain Monsters and Fallout 76 featured the Grafton Monster was because it's in the first few pages of Rosemary Ellen Guiley's Monsters of West Virginia, and thus easy to find, but that's just a personal opinion. Accessibility indeed drives folklore and information spread. 2014 Cockrell also implies that he never said it was a monster that he saw, and that this was all the result of the town rumor mill. But in his 1964 letter, he very clearly called it a monster, beast, and creature. He said that it had seal-like skin, and no discernible head, and seemed quite serious. He goes from calling his editor cynical of the monster in 1964, to saying he understood the story better than he did, as a people story in 2014. Perspective changes with age indeed. I for one think the story is both. It's about the people and the reported monster, with no reason to be cynical about either. In 1964, he also detailed his work investigating it, and supposedly recording similar sightings, of which he frustratingly gives little to no detail. To quote directly from the 1964 letter, he says, quote, "Over 100 teenagers first took up the search, and over 20 actually caught glimpses of it. I questioned several of them individually, and found their reports tallying to the finest detail. Several other people, adults as well as teenagers, reported seeing the monster at different times at varying points up the river. Some of these reports I discredited, but others I am inclined to believe." End quote. Then in 2014, he inexplicably says that no such investigation ever took place, and claims that Rosemary has got the facts wrong or is myth-making for simply repeating that detail verbatim. While there are plenty of paranormal investigators who don't let the facts get in the way of a good story, from what I've read of her literature at least, Rosemary Ellen Guiley was not one of them. She was a quality researcher, and her chapter on the subject was great given the material she had to work with. By dismissing Rosemary's write-up, he's essentially claimed that the material in his readily available 1964 letter is therefore pure fiction. Perhaps Robert Cockrell didn't remember writing that letter to Gray Barker, or perhaps he was embarrassed to admit that it wasn't just other people blowing up a misidentification, and it wasn't just other teenagers who were looking for a monster. Perhaps Robert Cockrell didn't want us to know how much he once believed in his own story. Perhaps he regretted writing that 1964 letter. As I often say, thank God for the archivists. Document everything. There's an old saying, be careful what you say, but be very careful what you write. It seems poor Bob's legacy is flash frozen at a point he later wouldn't have agreed with. Immortality isn't always accurate, it appears. There's nothing wrong with being mistaken, of course, or of misidentifying something in the dark. There is something a little bit wrong with trying to rewrite your own history and claim that you were never mistaken, or that you never played into the hype or the monster investigating. There is something a little bit wrong, but not all that much, with trying to wiggle off of that alleged hook. I suppose we can let it slide on this one, Bob. No hard feelings. From one monster researcher to another, and unashamedly so, on my part at least. It's a difficult thing, making a monster, but as Mary Shelley could tell you, once you've made a monster and put it out there, you have to deal with it. You can't run from it, and oftentimes, you can't kill it. A private world or character or notion, once spoken aloud, is no longer private. Most festival goers of the 21st century don't care if there is or isn't a Grafton monster. They just want a weird occasion for a street fair, a fun family outing, and to make odd folk art. Though I'm sure there are some true believers in the crowd. People who would agree with a young Robert Cockrell and disagree with an old Robert Cockrell. Just because he lost his monster faith doesn't mean they have to after all. It's a fascinating question. What happens when you're gifted a legacy that you don't really want? I've made my peace with the story, and with the man either way, of course. It's a twisted irony to see the mountain monsters were guests in attendance at the Grafton Monster Festival, while knowing that the man himself, Robert Cockrell, would have absolutely hated that. I can certainly understand how seeing a silly, sensationalized show like the Mountain Monsters featuring people running around the dark via green night vision, could make you want to deny your involvement. And once again, I'll be clear that I have nothing against people growing and changing over time, or people later saying that what they saw was most likely not a monster. It's helpful to clear things up, to be honest about not knowing or about past mistakes. I always encourage former hoaxers to come forward as well, and admit to doing so. It clears the path, and helps highlight the truly strange and mysterious. Of course, I have no idea what Robert Cockrell saw, and would never pretend to. The description is minimal, with not much to go off of. I highly doubt it was anything paranormal myself, but that's just me. I'll say that the story at this point reminds me in some ways of the Flatwoods Monster of 1952. The May brothers going up the hill with their mother and their friends, seeing something momentarily in the dark, we're not quite sure what, fleeing in terror and forever becoming folklore characters, whether they wanted to be or not. We don't know what they saw. It could have been something ordinary. It could have been anything. But the image of the Flatwoods Monster, as described by their mother, endures. Robert Cockrell saw something, momentarily in the dark. We're not quite sure what. It could have been anything. But what he himself described to Gray Barker as a large monster with seal-like skin and no discernible head, or simply a huge white obstruction by the road, became another piece of West Virginia's long list of folklore. After looking around at the vendors of the Grafton Monster Festival, I attended a Ghost Stories event in which the speaker told some spooky tales. The room all around included beautiful West Virginia folklore art, including one of my favorite Bigfoot-like creatures, the Apple Devils, which were reportedly small hairy creatures that supposedly stole apples from West Virginia apple orchards. Here is a clip of some of the ghost stories.
Back in the old days, folks here in the mountains, they made do with what they had, or they went without. And if you had an abundance, you shared it or you put it up. Been that way for a long time. And sometimes that abundance was in the form of corn. And if that abundance is in the form of corn, one of the I don't know, more locally traditional ways of putting it up is to ferment it and distill it. You know what I'm talking about? Well, that was going on for a long, long time before Prohibition. So back in the 1920s, there was a vicious moonshiner, up near Elkins in the Gilman, West Virginia area. He declared war on those revenuers. He said that he would murder any of them that came up there. You heard Rocky Top, you know, the two men who climbed up Rocky Top and they never came down? Yeah, it's like that. He would murder every one of the revenuers that came up there. He would dismember their bodies and cremate them in the charcoal furnace he had built. See, you need good clean heat to distill. And good clean heat comes from charcoal. Charcoal comes from wood. So he had himself a charcoal furnace, but he wasn't just burning wood in there. It went on for several years. But finally the murderer was caught by a group of federal men. They had combined their forces to avenge all the agents that had been murdered while doing their duty. It was almost dark when they made their capture, and the agents decided to wait until morning to transport the prisoner to federal jail. They put the moonshiner in an outbuilding and left one man on guard. That's not, one man on guard for this guy that's murdered all your buddies. That was a mistake. One man on guard. Huh. The rest went to bed. The next morning, the revenuers found their fellow worker lying unconscious outside the shed, which was empty, of course. They started to immediately comb the area. You know, you got to find this guy. About noon, one of them gave a signal shot. You know, back in those days, you didn't have all this walkie-talkies and stuff. Bang. That tells all your buddies within a mile that you need them, right? So they all gathered up there, and down in a little holler, hanging from a grapevine, was the man they were searching for. Evidently, he had tripped, fallen down the holler where the vine had caught him, and then he was done. After this, the local residents stated that each time they passed that holler, they could hear a moaning noise. I guess maybe he wasn't done all of a sudden. Maybe he hung there for a little bit. But they could hear the moonshiner's voice crying in pain.
After the ghost stories, I went on a ghost tour through Grafton. I wasn't aware that the town of Grafton was supposedly haunted, but I guess every small town in America is technically haunted, especially when a tour is to be had.
Let's cross the street because I think we should really. Yeah, you're already there. As you might imagine, there is tons of Civil War history in Grafton. This is some of the first battles took place, and the Union soldiers stayed here before doing battle with Philippi with the Confederates. And the first death of the Union soldier was here in Grafton. And I would tell you his name.
Bailey Brown.
Thank you, that's who it was. Yes. And so he died a very tragic death, and his wife joined them shortly thereafter from grief. So if we walk down that way just a little bit. This is the building that houses the gallery. It's part of the Franklin block. Upstairs, the second floor used to be a dance hall once upon a time. And that is where some of the folks, the residents of Latrobe Street, also worked. So every once in a while you can see somebody in the window up there. Again, we heard that there was a tragic death, a person being strangled, and we don't know whether it was a jealous wife or jealous husband. We have no idea, but that's how the story goes. And you may or may not see shadows up there. I can tell you we smell perfume, we hear music, we smell cigars. There's all sorts of things that happen. We can hear footsteps walk across. And again, at some point in the future, as we are able to remodel, there may or may not be an opportunity to do a ghost hunt or two before we completely get done. So, very cool building. I love it. It's amazing. It's beautiful upstairs. It's a bee's nest, like a symbol, and that's Masonic. And we know that there used to be Masons that met up there. That particular symbol, I've done some research on it, and it is supposed to be working together like a hive, doing good things, getting things done. So we work here, we can hear people moving or something walking across the floor upstairs. If we go in the back to turn on lights or to tuck things away, get things out, there's an area back here that we lovingly refer to as the scary, creepy hallway. So that's where we stuff things to stage things with. That is also the entrance to the downstairs basement, which is far creepier than the hallway. It is very creepy. And once upon a time, there used to be a pharmacy on the other side here. And we heard the story told that there was an apothecary apprentice that worked here, and he may or may not have accidentally poisoned people. So he is still trying to make amends and atone for his sins. So we can hear things shuffling around. We find pharmaceutical papers down there, like old prescriptions. We find the old metal tubes that are just waiting to be filled. We find the brown bottles, and we hear the noises and see the shadows. All right. Great. Yes. And a apothecary apprentice may or may not be approaching.
Taking the numbers.
We've heard that he is doomed to a life of service, so he's always here asking how he may serve you. But just a little heads up, don't let him. Do not let him. And again, thank you all very much. I know you didn't walk very far, Hopefully you had fun. We hope you enjoyed it and come back and see us.
There were people posing in windows, people dressed up as Civil War soldiers, and actors dressed up as ghosts and ghouls. If the tourists want to know, then of course it's haunted. Everywhere on Earth is, after all. Everyone has stories, and every community has tales of ghosts or the unexplained. Whether Robert Cockrell ultimately wanted to be part of it or not, the Grafton Monster legend has its place in the fabric of the town's backdrop, and amongst the modern mythology of West Virginia monsters. After the festival, we went to the classic-looking Dairy Queen there in Grafton, which strangely features in a lot of Grafton monster art, and I suppose is a big feature of the community, given that it's even mentioned in Robert Cockrell's Retraction article. I had my fun in June of 2024, but in July there was another monster event, the Veggie Man Day in Fairmont, dedicated to another West Virginia creature with connection to Gray Barker. But we'll have to cover that in another video. Stay tuned. This has been Appalachian Oddity. Thanks for watching, and Mountaineers are always free.